All new build homes in England must have an EV charger fitted from today, the 15th of June 2022. Sort of. It's been talked about for a while now that regulations were to be introduced in England to force developers to fit EV charging points to new housing.
New buildings must provide electric car chargers across England from 2022.
It's now 2022, and today, 15th of June 2022, the Part S of the building regulations comes into force, which sets out the standard for electric vehicle charging for all new and extensively refurbished dwellings in England. I'm seeing quite a lot of false information being spread about this change, particularly on social media as always. So let's talk about what it is and what it isn't, so that you've got the information you need if you're going to buy a new build home. Part S of the building regulations lays out the new rules for electric vehicle charging provision at new residential buildings, buildings undergoing a material change of use, buildings that have been extensively renovated, or those that are not residential at all. And let's be clear here, the building regulations lay out the standards for building in this country. And as a developer, you cannot, or at least should not, be building anything that doesn't comply with them. In order for the building to be signed off as complete and compliant, it must comply with the building regulations. Let's be clear though, there is a grace period for development that is ongoing. If a development was planned before the 15th of June 2022 and work started before 15th of June 2023, and that is literally a spade in the ground, it will be exempt from the new building regulations, and charge points will not necessarily need to be fitted unless it was a condition of planning for the development. Until now, electric vehicle charging provision for new developments was catered for in the planning process. Some councils would insist on EV chargers being installed, some wouldn't. These requirements range from very specific, you must fit a 7 kilowatt charger, to very, very vague, you must provide electric vehicle charging, which definitely made the interpretation of this legislation more difficult once it was announced. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail shortly. But to briefly summarise the new regulations, unless a very specific exemption criteria is met based upon the cost of grid connections, the number of associated parking spaces which have access to electric vehicle charging points must be either equal to the total number of parking spaces, if there are less parking spaces than there are dwellings. So if you maybe have a block of flats where some flats don't have a parking space, you could, as long as there's a charger in every space, that's fine. Or the number of associated parking spaces that is equal to the total number of dwellings when there are more. To summarise, if you're building a house, it will need to have an EV charger alongside its parking space. If you're building a block of flats with a communal car park, it will need to have at least as many charging points as there are spaces, if not one for each flat. Furthermore, if you were building a block of flats that had more spaces than one for each flat, every remaining space which didn't have a charger needs to have a cable run to it, so a charger could be installed there in the future. Now, that is a really good move. We cannot continue building new properties that don't have provision for charging, and I think that this is going to address that problem. There are a few issues. Some people say, well, if the developer fits a charger, they'll fit something cheap and nasty and then it'll be obsolete when you go to use it and all that. But the alternative here really is that either they cable it up and someone's got to come and commission that cable in the future, and it ends up no doubt costing you as much as it would to get a charge point installed, or it needs to come with a working charger. Now, there are a few common arguments about this that I'm seeing, and people are spreading like misinformation about this, and they're very, very skeptical. I think where housing developers are involved, people are naturally skeptical. So let's pick some of the most common holes in this, shall we? Here's what I'm seeing people are saying about it most often, and here is the truth about what this legislation actually means. The number one most common criticism of this I'm seeing is, oh well, these developers will just fit an outdoor 13 amp socket. They're not going to give you a proper charging point, are they? So it's going to be pretty useless, really. And this is not true in the slightest, but I do understand where it comes from. Remember when I said the EV charge point provision was previously handled through planning conditions? Some councils were not specific about their requirements at all, and a lot of builders took advantage of this, fitting just a bog standard outdoor 13 amp socket, calling it an EV charger. And here's a photo of the one in my house that I'm renting at the moment that was built last year. Not ideal, and the council actually really dropped the ball in this development, because what they said here was every dwelling must come with an outdoor 13 amp socket to enable future easier installation of EV charging. And I just don't see how it is, because I haven't checked, but unless that cable is properly rated, you're going to have to run a new cable from the house in order to replace it with a proper charger. And there was nothing in the planning conditions saying it had to be properly rated. So it's all just a bit of a disaster, really. And I mean, there's still 350 houses to be built here, maybe even more than that, that will have the same. They'll have an outdoor 13 amp socket, and then the developer, as far as they're concerned, has done their duty. They've done exactly what the planners asked them to do, but it's not really good enough, is it? But they cannot continue to do this once Part S of the building regulations comes into effect and applies to the development. And the reason for that is because the Part S outlines technical requirements for EV chargers that are as follows. Each electric vehicle charge point should meet all of the following requirements. It must be designed and installed to BS EN 61851. It must have a minimum nominal rated output of 7 kilowatts. It must be fitted with a universal socket, so it must be untethered, basically. Oh, but in exceptional circumstances for self-build projects and stuff, they might allow you to fit tethered, but on the whole, it'll be untethered, and I think that's a good thing. At the end of the day, they will end up being Type 2 untethered, which will charge any vehicle in existence. I think that's a good thing. It must be fitted with an indicator to show the equipment's charging status that uses lights or a visual display. Okay. It must be a minimum of Mode 3 specialised system for electric vehicle charging, running from a dedicated circuit or equivalent, as defined in BS EN 61851-1. It must meet the requirements of BS 7671, so it must be installed correctly, must have pen fault detection, all that lovely stuff. And it must meet the requirements in the IAT's Code of Practice for electric vehicle charging equipment installation. There are absolutely no situations where you could comply with this list of technical requirements by slinging in a 13 amp socket or one of these EV ready charge points that can't actually be used until you upgrade it and put the proper box in place, or a 32 amp commando socket or anything like that. Developers will be required to fit an actual 7 kilowatt untethered charge point, and that is it. There is no debate on that. They're not necessarily going to like it, but I mean, you can be sure the cost is just going to be passed on through the price of the houses that they're selling anyway. Next up, they'll find a way to say it was too expensive to provision chargers for each house, so we couldn't do it. Well, that one's not completely debunked. There is actually provision in the building regulations for this. However, I'd like to hope it's a little bit more strict than just taking the word for it. It's all based around the grid connection costs. If it's going to cost more than £3,600 per dwelling in connection costs alone to upgrade the grid supply to cope with the extra load from the charging, you can claim exemption from this part of the building regulations. But you must evidence this using multiple quotations for the work, and it's going to be scrutinised by building control before it gets signed off. I can't see your volume builders, your Taylor Wimpey, your Persimmon, your Bovis Homes, all that lot, bothering with this. If you're throwing up 1,000 houses in an area and you're claiming there's not a big enough power supply to give them EV charging, then you've probably massively underrated your services anyway, and you're going to come under even more scrutiny for that. I could perhaps see your smaller fly-by-night little developers going for this, where they're only building 3 or 4 houses, and well, it might be easier to get a pass on adding chargers than adding them, but I do think it's going to come under a lot of scrutiny and rarely be worth bothering with. It's certainly not going to be as easy to get away with as people seem to think, and I think that for the big volume developers, definitely it'll be easier just to comply, just to install chargers, and ultimately pass the cost on to the consumer. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to say, oh well, why should we pay for the cost of a charger if we don't have an electric car? Well, at the end of the day, there is going to come a time where everyone's going to need one anyway, and I think it's a pretty nonsense argument that slinging an extra £1,000 onto the cost of a house, and let's be honest, it will be less than that. I could get a charger installed at an old house for £1,000. There's no way it'll cost these new build guys that kind of money. Absolutely no danger. And finally, I'm buying a new build at the moment and it doesn't come with a charger, even though it'll be finished after the 15th of June. Well, I hear you. I'm actually looking to buy myself. I want to buy a house on this same development that I'm currently renting on. And as I said at the start of the video, it will not come with an EV charger. And that is because any development that is already in progress, was planned before the 15th of June 2022 and a spade was put in the ground before the 15th of June 2023 will be exempt. And unfortunately, that means that there will still be a lot of houses being built without proper EV charging provision, which is crappy to say the least, but it will start to filter through. I've already seen planning applications locally for upcoming developments with the charging provision clearly detailed, from developers that have got other sites in progress, like this one that I'm living in now, without it. It will have the desired effect, but it's very unfortunate for anyone that's bought or is buying a new home that doesn't come with a charger. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to strong arm the developer into giving you one. They might do it for a fee, they're definitely not going to do it out of some sense of obligation. I do hope that that clears things up for you. These new regulations are a good thing overall, and don't believe everything you read people saying about it on the internet. As fashionable as it is to slag off both housing developers and the government, and if you can do both at once, well, you're probably onto a winner, aren't you? But some of the stuff being said is just plain wrong, and I think these 3 key points are very important, and it's very important that you understand exactly what's going on. Do tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think it's a good thing? Are you upset that you'd end up having to bear the cost because you don't want a charger to be pre-installed, or you'd want to be able to pick your own, or whatever? I want to hear your opinions on this. Please do tell me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.